Miss Moore, can you first tell the viewers a little bit about you?
About myself.
Mm,
Okay, so you already said I was a professor at the University of Michigan. I've been here around 15 years. Before that, I taught at Vassar College. I grew up in New York and lived for many years in New York. I raised my kids in New York. And, so they were grown when we came out here, married the second one off, as it were. I'm a historian of American Jews and have written what turned out to be a kind of trilogy, although I didn't write it in order.
mm,
I wrote a book on New York Jews in the 1920s and 30s.
mm.
Then I wrote a book on Jews in Miami and LA in the post-war years. And then I wrote a book that linked the two of them called GI Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation. And that really covers a good chunk of the 20th century in terms of American Jews. Um, I'm also an editor. So I'm the editor-in-chief of the Poston Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, which is a 10-volume library of selections from original sources, all of them translated into English, so you can read them, I can read them. Right? You don't need to know half a dozen or more languages. Um, and those volumes have been coming out now. We're going to have half of it published by the end of March.
But let's talk about, so you did write those three books. Can you talk a little bit about them in depth? I know they're about people that lived in different parts of the country and how they made success on themselves. Can you go a little bit more in depth about that?
Sure.
Mhm.
So the story of New York Jews is in those years, in the 20s and 30s, is really a story about the children of immigrants. These are, native born American Jews. They grow up in New York. They go to public school. They go to public high school. Many of them also to college because you had free college in New York City at the time. And they are living through the Depression. So it's not an opportunity for them to succeed economically per se, but they are creating ways of being both American and Jewish at the same time. The young people especially are the ones who become soldiers in the military. They sign up to fight right after Pearl Harbor. They go into military service in all the different branches of the service. They go into, Army, Air Corps, Navy, Marines, you name it. And they discover when they get into the service that they're more Jewish than in the sense they realized. Because, growing up Jewish, it was the family, it was the street, it was, but now in the military, they're integrated, not like African Americans, they're integrated. So there are only a handful in any unit. They might be 1, 2 Jews in a unit. So being Jewish was now something inside them that they realized. They didn't look different, you see, from other Americans. They might have a different name, but they didn't look different. And yet they felt different. They saw this as a war, World War II, as a war against Nazism, against fascism. They wanted to fight the Nazis. They were only semi-aware of the Holocaust as it's unfolding, but they knew that Jews were being persecuted. And for them, World War II had a somewhat different meaning than for many Americans. Many American soldiers who went in wanted to fight the war against the Japanese. And that was their motivation. Right? So there are different motivations. On the other hand, in the military, the armed services recognized Judaism as a fighting faith of democracy. So Jews, Catholics, Protestants, all of them were part of the same, as you said, part of the same connection. And one of the things that happens as a result of the war is that these soldiers discover America beyond where they grew up. They're sent to train. If they're in the Air Corps, they're sent to Miami Beach, right? 25% of the Air Corps, officers trained on Miami Beach. If they ship out to the Pacific, they discover California. And so after the war, they decided, why do I want to go back to New York, Chicago? There are these beautiful places out there. And so that's where they go. And then they build new kinds of communities in LA, in Miami, that
Can
hadn't
I
been there before.
interject quick? I
Sure.
apologize for interrupting you,
No.
Professor. But my thing is, I went to college in Boca Raton in South Florida. You just spoke
Okay.
about Miami. So I think about Boca Raton, huge Jewish area in South Florida, along with Broward County, Miami-Dade,
Right.
Palm Beach, obviously, is where Boca is. So those are three areas as far as counties where it's really dominated as far as the Jewish population. Is that what you're saying as far as a lot of those people stayed in Miami and just kind of settled throughout time around South Florida?
So yeah, so what they would say is they got sand in their feet. And the soldiers would come back after the war, and they'd settle. So they started down in Miami and Miami Beach, and then they worked their way north up the coast. So, in the 50s, 60s, nobody was living in Boca, right? I mean, no Jews were living in Boca.
Right.
But later, more as you get an expanding population. So yes, it's not just soldiers to go down. It's also you have Social Security passed in the Depression. So people finally can retire and they can have an income. And so you have older people going down to Miami Beach, and then, as you said, Broward and Fort Lauderdale and stuff.
Can you talk to the viewers about how Harry Truman, I guess I should say, made that big effect on people that were Jewish in this country and also Israel in general?
Sure. So Truman has the United States be the first nation that recognizes Israel when Israel is declared a nation on May 15th. And I should say, of course, that the second nation is the Soviet Union, but, Truman gets in there first. I think also Jews felt warmly to Truman because he pushed for legislation that would help survivors after the Holocaust. Legislation that would bring some of them to the United States. And also, he was very concerned with how they were treated in camps in Europe, that they were not being treated fairly. So Truman not only became a supporter of the state of Israel, but he recognized how important it was after World War II, in addition, and how the survivors needed a place to go.
No, I thank you for that, because that was something that was always brought up throughout my time at school, and also in these Democratic clubs that I went to, where they talked a lot about Israel and Truman's effect on Israel and Jewish and people in general. I do want to talk about this, and again, for people that just tuning in, this is Professor Dash. She is a professor at the University of Michigan, and we're going to go on to other things that she's worked on and been a part of. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about the Poston Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, please?
Sure. And since you mentioned Truman and Israel, I have to mention what's on the cover. Can I show the cover? Does it work?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, because I don't know if you can see, but it's a picture of a man upside down, right? Okay, in a bathing suit, standing on his head. Well, that's a photograph of David Ben-Gurion.
Oh, okay, yes.
And it's on the cover because this is the volume that covers, the creation of the State of Israel. And Ben-Gurion's, he was obviously very good at standing on his head, but it also sort of reflects, the enormous changes, right, that occur, right? This volume covers from 73 to from 1939 to 1973. It's called Catastrophe and Rebirth. And in many ways, he represents the rebirth the state of Israel. So the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization has within it all kinds of excerpts from original sources in English that give you a taste of the diversity of Jewish culture. It also includes visual material, so that you have photographs, you have reproductions of paintings, sculptures. You even have some what do you call it? Comics, right?
Yes.
That because Jews made comics as well in this time period. And the idea is to let you, anybody listening, to have an opportunity to grasp for himself or herself just what Jewish culture is. And if you, it's available digitally. So if you go to posenlibrary.com and you register for free, you gain access to almost all this material right there.
What do people misconstrue about Jewish culture?
Okay. So what do they misconstrue? They think that Jewish culture is only religious, when it's not. It's much broader than religion. That's why I mentioned comics. You know, you have Captain America, which was created by Jews, and you, when you see it in this volume, you can tell it's created in part as a way of fighting the Nazis, right? This image that America should go out there and fight. So that's one misconception. The second misconception that people have about Jewish culture is that it's all created by men. And it's not. It's created by women too. So we have a lot of material in here by women, not just by men, which means that the culture is not what's only called, this is a third misconception, sort of high culture, Jewish thought, intellectual, but includes popular culture. So it will include things like children's literature. It will include, well, in some of the volumes we have cookbooks, for example, which lets you, as it were, taste Jewish culture. So it's really very expansive.
Now, we all know that Holocaust Remembrance Day is in April, and I know obviously you writing about Jewish culture and knowing it in depth. Can you talk about that in general?
So actually, I should say that there are two Holocaust Remembrance Days. There's one on the 27th of January, which is the European declared one. That was when Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviet army. And so it really marks the beginning of liberation, right? Not the end by any means. The April event, remembrance, is keyed to the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which Jews initiated against impossible odds, but managed to continue fighting against the Nazis, the Germans, for weeks, several weeks before they completely leveled the ghetto. So a Holocaust Remembrance Day takes in both Jewish suffering and we might say some measures of Jewish resistance. Some we could call certainly the Warsaw Ghetto uprising heroism, but resistance understood more broadly, and suffering at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a slave labor camp, but it was also a camp where people were just murdered, right? The trains would come in, they'd unload them, and people would be sent to the gas chambers. So it's marking the enormous breadth of the Holocaust. One of the things that you can find in this volume of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture is that the editors, Samuel Casso and David Roskies, decided to treat the entire Jewish world as a unit in this time period. So you'll get things that people may be familiar with. Let's say a selection from Anne Frank's diary. Right? People have heard of Anne Frank, but it will be right next to a selection about an attack on Jews in Baghdad, in Iraq, that occurred, where Jewish homes were pillaged, Jews were killed. We don't usually think of Iraq as part of the Holocaust, but it is. And at the same time, you'll get here the incredible funeral sermon that chaplain Rabbi Roland Gittleson gave at Iwo Jima, right? So this is all part of that world. And, and when he speaks, for example, at Iwo Jima, he talks about the dead. And just as you were saying before, how there's no differences between the dead, no difference between black and white, no difference between enlisted men and officers, no difference between immigrant and if your family came to the United States, 100 or 200 years ago. Theirs, he says, is a true democracy, right? And then he goes on to say, it's up to us, the living, right, to not betray them by dismantling this democracy, letting these distinctions reemerge, letting this hatred reemerge, right? But we have to be true to what they died for.
Can we talk a little bit about what we've learned, I guess, or we should have learned, I should say, because apparently right now, as we've said many times, we have not learned the lessons of the Holocaust. So what should have been, I guess, the lessons of the Holocaust?
Well, I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and they vary what you want to emphasize in the time period. Certainly, we have to we recognize what genocide is, which is something was not a term that existed before the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust leads to that notion of a deliberate bringing murder of people just because of who they are, what group they belong to, right? In the case of the Holocaust, because of Jews. So we know that genocide is something human beings can perpetrate, and that we should stop it. I think that one of the important lessons, which is in this volume, comes from Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who spoke in 1963 at the March on Washington, just before Martin Luther King spoke. And he said there that the greatest sin that he learned from living in Nazi Germany, and he left in 1938, he had to flee, was the sin of silence, of being onlookers, that you cannot be an onlooker. When you see injustice, it's very important to speak out. And he said America should not become a nation of onlookers. So I would say that that's really crucial for us to take home.
Going into that, Professor, again, you talked about the onlookers, that, don't be an onlooker. The rabbi did say that, but we have been. So what are we doing right now? Why are people giving Trump a pass? The Democrats, I should say, are not. They've impeached him twice. Obviously he's not president right now. He could still run again if he doesn't get convicted, which I believe he's not going to get convicted of impeachment. But regardless of what you think in that aspect, the country has taken a turn for the worse. We saw what happened on January 6th. We see what's going to happen down the road, that these people that were marching on January 6th, that broke into the Capitol, that did the anti-Semitic behavior at the rallies, are not going away. Pandora's box is open, and there's no way Joe Biden or anybody else can shut the box. It's open. They're out there.
Well, what haven't we learned? You're right. The last 4 years have been really terrible. 5 years. It's So I think it's really important to prosecute people, to restore respect for the law.
Yeah.
Because people were breaking the law when they did these things. You don't just go into a synagogue and murder 11 people and figure, oh, well, that's just okay. And get praise on the internet, right, for doing that. There needs to be serious prosecution, not just of the acts, but also prosecution of all the planning that people do. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Michigan, right? We had people who were planning to kidnap the governor, right? And these people have to be prosecuted. And there needs to be a return to respect for the law, and not a willingness just to say, oh, well, that's a fringe, because as we see, it's not a fringe. And I think for too long, you know, you think back to the bombing in Oklahoma City, for example, but for too long, it's been seen, oh, well, it's just one or two people, but it's not. And that is the attitude that really needs to change. Recognize how widespread are these myths. I think it's crucial to recognize when a myth is spoken, that it is a myth, and to call it such. You know, it took a long time for people to call out the lies that the president spoke. There continue to be people in Congress who are enablers. I think they should be censored. They don't belong in Congress. They're not upholding the oaths of office that they took, and they should be censored.
I do appreciate your time, Professor. You are an American treasure, and we need people like you to keep spreading the word of Jewish history and Jewish studies, because people need to hear these stories about these great people that have done great things. So I do appreciate your time. Let's end the interview with some hope, though. Can you tell the viewers, you know, some way that they can dig down and get some hope with the Joe Biden presidency? Anything that you would tell the president, maybe, to make him a success in his first term as president of the United States?
Well, I think that when Biden called for us to listen to each other and to be respectful of each other, even if we don't agree with each other, that is really important. And that's important not just across, you know, conservative and more liberal lines, but it's important within the world of people who are liberal and progressive. You don't have to come up with unanimity. You do need to be able to hear what the other person has to say, listen with respect, and disagree. And I will end with a Jewish note. There's a notion in Judaism of arguments for the sake of heaven. And those are the kinds of arguments that we need, which is to say, you disagree, you don't necessarily come up with a conclusion, but the argument itself is part of a search for truth, for the sake of heaven. So let us have arguments for the sake of heaven.
Well said. Where can people find more about you, Professor Dash?
More. You can, I have a little website where they can go to as part of the University of Michigan. They can also, of course, go to the PostonLibrary.com and find wonderful material on Jewish culture and civilization. So, yeah.
What about the books, though? They can look
the
at the
books.
books.
Oh, the books are, you have to buy the books or go to the library. And the libraries will loan them to you. Right. They're listed on my website, but you can't download them from the website. They're just the covers of the books.
Well, they could buy them on Amazon or go to the Barnes and Noble.
And they're all on paperback, and yeah, that's right.
All right,
And
I'll put in the
undoubtedly
description.
used copies too, which are cheap. So I don't
Well,
make any money from that, but that's fine.
don't say that. Don't say that.
It's
We'll
okay.
cut that part out. Definitely get the books. You can buy them on Amazon. Also buy them at Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore if you can find them, because we try to keep those bookstores alive as much as we
I
can,
approve
rather.
of that too.
All
Yes.
right. So, I mean, Professor, thanks so much again, Professor Dash. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
All